March 17, 1943. In Berlin, the silence of a cold office shattered as a thick folder slammed onto a polished mahogany desk, splattering coffee across sensitive reports. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, stared at the papers in disbelief. His hands trembled not from fear of the Gestapo but from what the numbers claimed. America, the land the Nazis mocked as weak, unfocused, and chaotic, was supposedly producing one of the most complex machines in human history, the four-engine B-24 Liberator bomber, at the impossible pace of one every 63 minutes. Not every day, not every week, but nearly one an hour. To German eyes, this was no less than sorcery, a mathematical nightmare that defied every assumption on which Hitler's war had been built. Through the tall windows of his office, Canaris could see Berlin's canals glinting in the gray light, but his thoughts were thousands of miles away in Detroit. Reports from agents in Mexico City, Sweden, Spain, and even neutral Switzerland all pointed to the same conclusion. Ford's Willow Run factory was unlike anything the Germans had ever conceived. A mile-long assembly line, 42,000 workers, entire bombers broken down into 60,000 separate tasks, each performed by men and women trained in days, not years. Even nature itself seemed stunned by the scale. Clouds formed under the roof of the factory and rain sometimes fell indoors. German spies had traced aluminum shipments, rail records, and intercepted communications. Everything confirmed what their leaders refused to accept. America was building an air fleet so vast it could blot out the sky. But belief was dangerous in Nazi Germany. Canaris knew what was at stake. To deliver these reports to Hitler or Göring was to risk being branded a defeatist or worse, a traitor. The ideology of the Reich was clear. Democracy was weak, diversity was inefficient. Women belonged in kitchens, not factories, and industrial miracles were impossible outside the control of the so-called master race. Yet here was proof that women riveters, African-American machinists, and teenage apprentices were building more bombers in a month than the entire Luftwaffe could manage in a year. Numbers do not lie, but in Berlin, numbers were less powerful than ideology. Canaris whispered to his deputy, "If these reports are true, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer about courage or strategy. It is only mathematics and time." And still, when the intelligence reached Göring's desk, the Reichsmarshal laughed. He scoffed that the Americans could build refrigerators, not warplanes. He mocked the idea that a democracy of immigrants could ever outproduce a disciplined dictatorship. Hitler, too, waved away the reports as fantasy, refusing to imagine that a single factory could rival the industrial might of an entire nation. Their laughter echoed off the marble walls, but it was hollow, because even as they dismissed the truth, somewhere across the Atlantic another bomber was rolling off the line, its rivets still warm, its engines waiting to roar. The fate of the Reich was sealed not in secret weapons or battle plans, but in the relentless rhythm of an American assembly line. Would you believe it? Type yes in the comments if this shocked you, and get ready, because the story of Willow Run is more than a tale of bombers. It's the story of how arrogance blinded a regime, how democracy turned factories into weapons, and how spies who brought the truth were ignored until it was far too late. From the earliest days of the war, Nazi propaganda had hammered a single message into the minds of German soldiers. Democracy was weak, America was lazy, and a nation of immigrants could never stand against the discipline of the Reich. Joseph Goebbels filled the airwaves with speeches mocking the United States as a land of jazz, chewing gum, and consumerism, where factories produced frivolous comforts like refrigerators and cars but lacked the precision for serious military power. To the average German soldier, the idea that America could mass-produce heavy bombers seemed laughable. Göring himself declared that Americans were incapable of building anything more complicated than a razor blade. And so for years the belief hardened. If America entered the war, it would drown in its own chaos. But the reality, quietly documented by German intelligence officers, was the exact opposite. As early as 1941, reports trickled in from Washington, Mexico City, and neutral Europe that American factories were retooling at a scale that defied comprehension. When German attachés warned that U.S. aircraft production might reach 2,000 planes a month, Göring had literally laughed in their faces. Hitler waved the claims away as Allied propaganda. And yet by 1943, the evidence had become impossible to ignore. The Willow Run plant alone was producing more aircraft each month than all of Germany's factories combined. This wasn't propaganda. It was arithmetic, confirmed by manifests, photographs, intercepted telegrams, and eyewitness accounts. Still, the Reich's leaders dismissed it. To believe the numbers meant admitting that their entire worldview, their entire ideology was wrong. The stakes of this denial were nothing less than the survival of the Reich. If America truly could produce a bomber every hour, the war was no longer a contest of strategy or bravery. It was a countdown clock. Every 63 minutes, another bomber rolled off the line. Every day, hundreds of aircraft joined the skies. By 1944, the skies above Europe would belong not to the Luftwaffe, but to the Allies, who could overwhelm German defenses by sheer weight of numbers. Intelligence officers like Canaris knew the truth. This wasn't just about production, it was about inevitability. Once American factories reached full stride, no amount of German courage could balance the scales. The war had become mathematics, and mathematics was merciless. Inside Germany, however, those who spoke this truth risked their lives. To suggest that American diversity was strength, not weakness, was to defy Nazi racial theory. To admit that women and minorities could outperform the so-called master race was to invite accusations of treason. Reports confirming American production figures were suppressed, ridiculed, or destroyed. Canaris himself watched as meticulously gathered evidence was brushed aside with contempt. He told his deputies that Germany was not suffering from a lack of intelligence, but from a lack of wisdom. The information was there, gathered at enormous risk by spies and analysts across the globe. What was missing was the courage to believe it. The irony was brutal. While Nazi leaders mocked America's supposed inefficiency, ordinary American workers, many of them women who had never held a factory job before, were driving rivets into bombers with precision. African American machinists operated complex tools, teenagers managed supply lines, and immigrants who spoke with accents built engines that would roar over Berlin. In Germany, propaganda insisted such people were weak and corrupt. In America, they were proving to be the backbone of the arsenal of democracy. For every hour German officers wasted debating whether the reports were real, another B-24 rolled off the line. For every sneer from Göring, another squadron of bombers crossed the Atlantic. This was the true context and stakes of the Willow Run story. It wasn't just about industrial production. It was about the collapse of ideology in the face of cold, hard numbers. Germany's leaders had built their war on myths. The myth of Aryan superiority, the myth of democratic weakness, the myth of inevitable German victory. But Willow Run shattered all of them. Every new bomber was a reminder that lies cannot stand against reality. And as Canaris warned, Germany's defeat was already written, not in battles or speeches, but in the relentless hum of an American assembly line. In Mexico City, the war played out not in trenches but in smoky cafes and crowded hotel lobbies. German intelligence had cultivated businessmen, diplomats, and oil executives, men who traveled freely between Detroit and the oil fields of Mexico. At one reception in February 1943, Harold Morrison, an American oil executive already 2 drinks deep, leaned across a table to impress his Mexican hosts. He described what he had seen at Ford's Willow Run plant, a building so vast that clouds formed under its roof and rain sometimes fell indoors, an assembly line so long it seemed to swallow entire aircraft and spit them out complete on the other end. Morrison sketched on a napkin, laughing about women installing hydraulic lines in bombers as easily as cooking breakfast. He never noticed that at the next table, Wolfgang Blau, a German agent posing as an Argentine leather merchant, was memorizing every word. That napkin sketch, carried across oceans through diplomatic pouches and coded cables, became one of the first threads in a web of truth the Reich refused to believe. In Spain, the trail deepened. Colonel José Hungría, the Spanish military attaché in Washington, had cultivated a reputation as a sympathetic ear to American engineers. At a reception in 1943, he cornered Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief and the mastermind behind Willow Run. Sorensen, eager to boast of his achievement, spoke as though he were describing the crown jewel of democracy itself. He explained how bombers were broken into 60,000 separate operations, how each worker repeated the same task until perfection was inevitable, how assembly flowed like rivers converging into a sea. He compared the process to the automobile lines Ford had perfected years earlier. "We build bombers like we build cars," Sorensen declared proudly, unaware that every word would be whispered into German ears within weeks. For Hungary, the revelation was staggering. The Americans had not only mastered aviation, they had industrialized it. Farther north in Sweden, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Erik Lundberg, a Swedish engineer visiting Willow Run, returned home with eyes wide from what he had witnessed. He wrote that the Americans had invested $200 million in specialized machine tools, many designed for single operations, some so unique that nothing comparable existed in Europe. He marveled at the scale, 1/600 machines working in unison, tens of thousands of workers trained in days, not years, churning out bombers at a speed no European engineer could fathom. His report passed through diplomatic channels to Berlin, confirmed what agents in Mexico and Spain had already said. The numbers weren't fantasy, they were fact. Through Argentina, through Switzerland, through neutral embassies in Ankara and Madrid, the same impossible story echoed again and again. German agents intercepted letters from American workers, bragging to relatives in Sweden and Switzerland about their jobs in factories that produced planes like sausages. Reports flowed in from businessmen who had toured Detroit and returned babbling about mile-long buildings where women in bandanas riveted metal skins onto bombers. Japanese intelligence officers, too, whispered of Willow Run, passing on intercepted messages to Berlin. Every channel, every source, every document pointed to the same truth. America's industrial miracle was real. For German intelligence officers, the effect was dizzying. They gathered these fragments like shards of glass, fitting them together into a picture that revealed something terrifying. Ritter, a former Lufthansa pilot who had lived in New York before the war, understood better than most. He told Canaris plainly, "If these numbers are correct, and I believe they are, then Germany has already lost." The reports showed not just numbers, but inevitability. Willow Run was not a rumor. It was a machine, vast and relentless, producing bombers at a pace no ideology could dismiss. Yet, the closer the intelligence officers came to the truth, the more dangerous it became to present it. In a regime built on lies, reality itself was a death sentence. And so the trail of intelligence flowing from Mexico's cafes, Spain's embassies, and Sweden's engineers converged into Berlin like rivers pouring into the sea. It should have been undeniable. Multiple sources, independent verification, photographic evidence. But when placed before Göring and Hitler, the truth dissolved into mockery. To the men who ruled the Reich, it was easier to laugh at the Americans than to believe that democracy, women, and minorities were outproducing the master race. The spies had done their job. The numbers were solid. But in Berlin, the greatest intelligence failure of the war had already begun. Not in the collection of facts, but in the refusal to believe them. When the first comprehensive reports reached Berlin, Göring barely glanced at the figures before bursting into laughter. At a council meeting thick with cigar smoke, he waved the papers in the air like they were children's drawings. "The Americans can build refrigerators, not bombers," he sneered, his voice booming off the marble walls. The officers seated around the table chuckled nervously, more out of fear than agreement. Göring leaned back in his oversized chair, medals gleaming across his chest, his immense body shaking with amusement at what he called clumsy Allied propaganda. To admit otherwise would have meant questioning the racial dogma he preached daily, that democracy was weakness, that immigrants were chaos, and that women in factories were a laughable notion. In Göring's mind, the very idea of women riveting metal or African Americans managing machines was an insult to common sense. He dismissed it all with contempt. Hitler's rejection was harsher still. When Canaris presented him with evidence, intercepted rail manifests showing aluminum shipments to Detroit, photographs smuggled from Spain of the Willow Run line stretching into the horizon, and written reports from no fewer than 17 independent sources, Hitler slammed his hand on the oak table. His eyes burned with rage as he spat the words, "Impossible. Impossible in 16 months." He reminded his generals that it had taken Germany 6 years to prepare for war, to design, test, and finally mass-produce modern aircraft. The idea that a so-called mongrel democracy could achieve in months what the Reich had perfected in years was unthinkable to him. To admit such a thing would be to confess that their entire ideology was a lie, so he dismissed it not with analysis but with fury. For Canaris, it was a nightmare. He laid out documents like cards in a game already lost, pointing to numbers, photographs, even testimonies from engineers and diplomats who had seen Willow Run with their own eyes. But each time, the papers were brushed aside, dismissed as enemy trickery or propaganda designed to weaken German resolve. Göring scoffed that the Americans had staged photographs with wooden mock-ups. Hitler claimed that the Allies had fabricated rail records. Even Speer, who understood industry better than anyone else in the Reich, could only remain silent, knowing that to support Canaris openly was to sign his own death warrant. The psychological tension in those rooms was suffocating. Officers who knew the numbers were real sat in silence, staring at their boots, unwilling to challenge the fury of their leaders. They understood that truth had no place in Hitler's Germany, only ideology did. And so, while Willow Run rolled out another bomber every hour, German generals clung to arrogance and denial. Canaris watched powerless as reality was torn apart in front of him, each piece of evidence shredded by laughter and rage. It was one of the greatest intelligence failures in history, not because the information wasn't there, but because those who held power chose blindness over belief. While Nazi leaders laughed in Berlin, across the Atlantic the truth thundered louder than any speech. Outside Detroit in Ypsilanti, Michigan, an ocean of steel and glass rose from the farmland. The Willow Run plant, the beating heart of America's arsenal of democracy. It stretched more than a mile in length, a building so vast that workers swore clouds gathered under the roof and rain sometimes fell indoors. Day and night the place roared like a living thing, a city under one roof where 42,000 workers moved in perfect rhythm. The scale was incomprehensible to German eyes. It was not just a factory but a battlefield of industry, one where machines and manpower joined forces to defeat ideology. Inside, the assembly line unfurled like a river of steel. At one end, raw aluminum sheets arrived on freight cars. At the other, finished B-24 Liberators rolled out ready to take to the skies. Along the line, sections of wings, fuselages, and tail assemblies converged with mechanical precision, each flowing in from different directions until they locked together like puzzle pieces. For American engineers, it was elegant efficiency. For German spies who described it in hushed tones, it was a miracle. Where European factories still built aircraft one at a time, swarmed by teams of workers, Willow Run produced them like automobiles. One task repeated endlessly, perfection achieved through repetition. What seemed impossible in Berlin was routine in Michigan. The workforce itself was a weapon. Women with bandanas tied around their hair, nicknamed Rosies, leaned over rivet guns, fastening metal skins with sparks flying around them. African-American machinists worked side by side with white colleagues on lathes and drill presses, operating machines that Nazi racial theory insisted they could never understand. Teenagers, barely 16, managed supply chains, cataloging parts with an efficiency that kept the line flowing without pause. Immigrants with thick accents tightened bolts, fit hydraulic lines, and wired instruments, their hands building the planes that would one day fly over their old homelands now under German occupation. Democracy had mobilized its people, all of them, and together they achieved what a dictatorship could not. The rhythm of production was relentless. Ford engineers had broken down the bomber into 60,000 separate operations, each simple enough to be mastered in days. One woman installed the same hydraulic tube again and again, until her hands could do it blindfolded. Another worker fitted windows, another wired radios, another sealed fuel tanks. Each tiny act meant nothing in isolation, but together they created an 18-ton war machine every 63 minutes. It was this specialization, this division of labor perfected by Ford, that allowed Willow Run to accomplish the impossible. While Göring scoffed that bombers could not be built like cars, the Americans were proving him wrong one rivet at a time. The evidence was overwhelming, even visible from the skies. Spies reported parking lots filled with 12,000 cars, proof of three-shift operations. Freight sidings lined with rail cars delivered a flood of aluminum, steel, and rubber. At the adjacent airfield, rows of brand-new B-24s gleamed under the sun, dozens at a time, engines already humming for test flights. Swedish engineers described 1,600 specialized machine tools operating in harmony, their cost alone dwarfing entire German industrial investments. Spanish diplomats marveled at the sheer speed, calling it efficiency that defies European understanding. Even neutral observers confessed they could not fathom how democracy, had transformed breakfast cooks and farmhands into bomber builders overnight. By 1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. Willow Run produced 650 bombers in a single month, more than the Luftwaffe could build in half a year. At peak, one Finnish B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. 24 planes a day, hundreds a month, thousands in a year. It was a storm of steel and fire, created not by myth or ideology but by free people doing their jobs. The Germans had dismissed the reports as propaganda, but the sky above Europe would soon prove otherwise. For every sneer in Berlin, another shadow appeared overhead, another bomber built by women, immigrants, and minorities who had been underestimated. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was proof that democracy could outproduce tyranny, that freedom itself had become a weapon of war. By early 1944, the truth that Göring and Hitler had refused to accept was no longer hidden in intercepted reports or whispered at embassy receptions. It was roaring overhead in formations, so vast that the sky itself seemed to groan under their weight. German civilians who had once dismissed stories of America's industrial miracle as enemy propaganda now shaded their eyes and stared upward in disbelief as wave after wave of bombers thundered across the heavens. The age of denial was over. Willow Run's assembly lines had become a storm that no amount of ideology could contain. The first crushing blow came in February 1944, during what became known as Big Week. For 6 consecutive days, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched massive raids against German aircraft factories. Over 1,000 bombers filled the skies each day, escorted by sleek P-51 Mustangs with the range to protect them deep into the Reich. In less than a week, more tonnage was dropped on Germany's industrial heart than the Luftwaffe had managed against Britain during the entire Blitz. For German intelligence officers who had warned their leaders for years, the sight was bitter vindication. Their carefully gathered data had been right all along. Every 63 minutes in Michigan, another plane had been built, and now those planes were delivering their verdict in fire and steel. Luftwaffe pilots who scrambled to intercept them returned shaken. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, reported to Göring, "Herr Reichsmarschall, I counted more than 800 bombers in a single formation." His words carried no exaggeration. To pilots used to facing dozens of enemy planes at most, the sight of hundreds upon hundreds moving like an iron tide was devastating. They dove into the formations, guns blazing, but for every bomber brought down, 5 more filled the gap. German factories lay in ruins, their production crippled, while the Americans simply replaced losses with fresh squadrons born of Detroit's steel arteries. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over the beaches of Normandy, the scale of American air power reached its zenith. More than 11,000 Allied aircraft dominated the skies, an armada of steel that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. The Luftwaffe scraped together fewer than 300 fighters in response, a pitiful force against a horizon darkened by Willow Run's legacy. For the German soldiers on the ground, it was like fighting under a storm they could never escape. Every road, every bridge, every bunker was hammered from above. The myth of Luftwaffe superiority, once a cornerstone of Nazi pride, lay shattered in the surf of Normandy. The turning point was not a single battle, but the relentless accumulation of American production. By the summer of 1944, Willow Run and its sister factories had unleashed tens of thousands of bombers and fighters across Europe. The numbers were not only staggering but decisive. Where Germany had built under 100,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 in the same period while fighting a 2-ocean war. The Reich, blinded by arrogance, had prepared for hundreds of bombers. It faced thousands. It had prepared for occasional raids. It faced daily bombardment, every refusal to believe intelligence reports, every laugh at America's propaganda had become another nail in Germany's coffin. For men like Canaris, who had tried to deliver the truth, the turning point was bitter. By 1944, he had been removed from his post, branded a defeatist, and placed under suspicion. The same regime that had silenced him now faced the consequences of ignoring his warnings. Willow Run's mile-long line had done more than build bombers, it had built inevitability. The collapse of German defenses was no longer a possibility but a certainty, written not in speeches or maps but in the rhythm of machines that never slept. America had weaponized production, and the result was a sky filled with judgment. The collapse of the Reich was written not in sudden catastrophe but in the slow, grinding refusal to accept reality. German intelligence had never lacked skill or bravery. Their networks spanned continents. Their agents risked death in every whispered conversation and every smuggled photograph. By 1943, they had assembled one of the most complete intelligence pictures of the war. Manifests of aluminum shipments, photographs of Willow Run's mile-long roof, reports from 17 independent sources all confirming the impossible truth. They had done their job. What failed was not collection, it was belief. The tragedy of German intelligence was that their leaders preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Inside the walls of power, ideology smothered fact. Göring mocked the numbers because they undermined his pride. Hitler dismissed reports because they contradicted the myth of Aryan superiority. Even when photographs revealed parking lots crammed with thousands of cars, proof of multiple shifts working around the clock, they were waved away as American trickery. Even when intercepted manifests showed aluminum consumption greater than Germany's entire national output, the numbers were torn up and thrown aside. The more evidence piled up, the louder the denials became. By 1944, Canaris and Oster, two of the few officers willing to speak the truth, were branded defeatists. Both men were executed at Flossenbürg in April 1945, their warnings silenced even as the skies thundered with the bombers they had tried to warn against. Post-war interrogations revealed the depth of the blindness. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister and perhaps the only Nazi leader who truly understood industrial scale, admitted that he had known the reports were accurate as early as 1943. In his private diary he wrote, "If these figures are even half true, then we face not defeat but annihilation." Yet he stayed silent. To speak was to sign his death warrant. Others confessed the same dilemma. Admiral Canaris' subordinates told Allied interrogators, "We were drowning in intelligence. The tragedy was not that we lacked it, but that we lacked leaders willing to believe it." In one of history's cruelest ironies, German intelligence had been too good, its accuracy so damning that to report it honestly meant suicide. The consequences of this arrogance were catastrophic. Resources continued to pour into wonder weapons and doomed bomber projects even as the skies filled with Allied formations, too large to challenge. German strategists planned for a few hundred bombers. They faced thousands. Peace overtures that might have saved millions of lives were delayed, because leadership refused to admit the inevitability of defeat. Cities burned, civilians starved, and soldiers died in hopeless battles, all because men at the top chose myth over math. Historians now call it one of the greatest failures of intelligence acceptance in modern warfare. A regime destroyed not by ignorance, but by its own refusal to believe the truth staring it in the face. The lessons echo far beyond 1945. Accurate intelligence means nothing if leaders cannot see past their own ideology. Numbers mean nothing if pride blinds men to their implications. The story of Willow Run is not just about airplanes or factories. It is about cognitive bias, about the human tendency to reject truths that challenge our deepest beliefs. Nazi Germany had built its identity on myths of superiority, and when confronted with proof that women, minorities, and immigrants were building bombers faster than the Reich could imagine, it chose denial over adaptation. In doing so, it sealed its own destruction. And yet there is also a warning for every generation that followed. Reality does not bend to ideology. Mathematics does not yield to mythology. The Germans had the truth in their hands, photographs, reports, eyewitness accounts, but they ignored it because it did not fit their worldview. In the end, that blindness killed more Germans than any Allied bomb. It destroyed cities, armies, and the very state they claimed would last 1,000 years. For all the might of the Wehrmacht, the Reich was undone not by lack of intelligence but by lack of wisdom, and the echoes of that failure remain a lesson etched into history. When leaders mock truth in favor of myth, tragedy is inevitable. In the end, the story of Willow Run was not just about steel rivets and mathematics. It was about people, ordinary Americans whose lives had been uprooted by war and who answered the call not with rifles but with wrenches and rivet guns. Among them was Rose Will Monroe, a single mother who had never dreamed of working in a factory. She tied back her hair with a red bandana, stepped onto the mile-long line and began driving rivets into the skin of B-24 Liberators. She became one of thousands who embodied the spirit of Rosie the Riveter. To Nazi eyes, women belonged in kitchens. To America, they became the builders of machines that would decide the fate of continents. Monroe later recalled, "Every rivet we drove was going to help end the war. We worked double shifts sometimes, sleeping in the parking lot between shifts. We had brothers, husbands, sweethearts flying these planes. We couldn't let them down." She was not alone. African-American workers, long denied opportunities in many industries, now found themselves running precision lathes, welding fuselages, and operating machine tools worth more than entire German factories. Immigrants with broken English tightened bolts and wired cockpits, building the very bombers that would one day fly over their old homelands, still under Nazi occupation. Teenagers fresh from school learned to manage supply chains, cataloging tens of thousands of parts that kept the line flowing without pause. Disabled workers too played their part, proving that in democracy even those deemed unfit by fascist ideology could contribute to victory. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was the embodiment of a society that had mobilized all of its people, every hand and every voice, to meet the challenge of tyranny. What shocked the Germans most was not simply the scale of production, but who was behind it. Nazi racial ideology had declared that women, minorities, and immigrants were weak, corrupt, and incapable of serious work. Yet it was precisely those groups who became the backbone of America's industrial miracle. The so-called inferior were building superior machines in numbers that dwarfed the Luftwaffe. The very existence of Willow Run was a living contradiction of everything Hitler's Reich claimed to believe. Democracy had turned diversity into strength, freedom into productivity, and equality into a weapon. Where Germany clung to myth, America wielded reality. By war's end, the verdict was undeniable. Willow Run alone produced 8,685 bombers. Combined with sister factories, the United States built more than 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945, 3 times what Germany managed while fighting on a single front. The skies above Europe told the story plainly. Thousands of Allied bombers darkening the horizon, a tide of steel and fire that no propaganda could explain away. And when German intelligence officers were interrogated after the war, they admitted what had doomed them. One wrote bitterly, "The tragedy was not that we lacked information. The tragedy was that our leadership refused to believe it because it contradicted their ideology." The lesson of Willow Run endures. In 1985, at the dedication of the Yankee Air Museum on the site of the old factory, Rose Will Monroe, Rosie the Riveter herself, met former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Rudel. He asked her with genuine wonder, "How did you build so many so fast?" Monroe smiled and answered simply, "Honey, we just went to work every day and did our job. Nothing fancy. Just punch in, build bombers, punch out. Democracy isn't complicated. It's just free people doing their best." Her words captured what no intelligence report could. The secret weapon of the United States was not a machine, but its people. And that is why the story of Willow Run matters. It reminds us that arrogance blinds, ideology destroys, but truth, when embraced, builds strength. German spies counted every plane, reported every number, and still their leaders laughed. But the workers of Willow Run didn't laugh. They worked. Rivet by rivet, shift by shift, they built the arsenal that broke the Reich. Democracy, underestimated and mocked, had turned out to be the deadliest weapon of all.